Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at a part 2 cue card for the IELTS speaking test. In fact, the cue card that we're looking at in this video is one that someone asked me to give a sample answer on in the comments. Now, actually, the task card that they asked me to look at is not one that comes directly from one of the Cambridge IELTS series, which is pretty unheard of for me because I like to go for those reliable kind of part 2 cue cards that I know have come from the same people who write the actual IELTS test. But this cue card is quite a common one, I think, that people have experienced in the actual test. The only problem is when I looked for this cue card on the internet, well, because it's not coming directly from the source of the people who make the IELTS speaking test, there's a bit of disagreement on what the actual cues are on the cue card. But I've really used my experience here to come up with kind of 4 appropriate cues that fit the style of this type of task that you're going to get in the speaking test. Now, the cue card that we're looking at today is asking us to describe a wedding that you have attended. So what I'll do here in this video is just go through the cue card and the different cues that we have in the cue card, and I'll go through the planning stage, think about how I would personally plan my answer for this cue card. And in next week's video, I will give the full detailed answer. So if you have a look at this cue card here, you can see we've got the 4 cues underneath that initial statement at the top, and it's telling us what we should say. Now, of course, you don't have to go through those 4 cues. As long as you talk about that wedding that you have attended, it would be fine. But my advice to students really is to follow those 4 cues. And of course, this task card is asking us to describe a wedding, which is a common style of task where you have to describe some kind of event, or it will ask you to describe a party or a festival, or well, here we actually have a wedding, which is like a type of party, but the category I would say this falls into is event. So it's a common style of part 2 tasks that you might get and have to talk about. You can see in those 4 cues, the first one is whose wedding it was. So, well, you're going to have to talk about the 2 people who got married. Then the second one, you can see when and where it was. So, of course, the time and the place, and gradually going into more and more detail as you expand on the information you've got for that cue. Then the third cue, what happened at the wedding. And of course, you want to give lots of detail about things that happened. You could also tell a little story for that cue as well. And then the final cue, always really this final cue is getting you to describe your feelings. It's some kind of question like how you felt or why question that you get in that final cue. And here it says explain how you felt at the wedding. So of course you can go into detail about your feelings when you were there at the wedding. So those are the 4 cues, and maybe you can think of your own ideas for what you would say for each of those cues and kind of the ideas that you would expand on. But now I'm going to give you what my ideas would be, and then of course go into a bit more detail and think about some of the vocabulary I might use to explain those ideas. So for the first one, whose wedding it was, and of course it's important when you're in the test to make this decision very quickly on who or you're going to talk about here, or which wedding you're going to talk about that you have been to in the past. And for me, one that comes to mind straight away is my sister's wedding. So whose wedding it was? Well, my sister, and of course her now husband, who is my brother-in-law. So I'll write down those 2 people, my sister and my brother-in-law. That would be, well, my notes that I would make for that cue. And of course, when I'm speaking, I would go into more detail describing those two people and maybe also some information on how they met. So then I would move on to the second cue and think of an idea for that, and that is when and where it was. So really two things here rather than just one, when and where, the time and the place. But I'm just going to keep it simple with the basic idea in my notes. When, 5 years ago, and where, well, Belgrade, which is the city where this wedding was held. So we've got those two ideas, and of course I can go into more detail and be more specific with the exact time and place. Then we've got the third cue, which is what happened at the wedding. And again, of course, like I said, you can go into lots of detail on this, give a little short story when you're speaking. But really, I'm just going to write down the kind of two main ideas here, of, well, the two main parts of the wedding, which was the ceremony and the party, right? It was kind of split into two parts. So the ceremony and the party. So there we go, those two main ideas. And of course, I would go into more detail when I'm explaining them in the full 2-minute response. And then that final cue, which is explain how you felt at the wedding. And here I'm just going to keep it simple. One word, one adjective to describe my feeling at the wedding, which is emotional. Well, it was my sister's wedding, so of course I'm going to have kind of lots of different feelings here. So the word emotional kind of fits that. And of course I can go into more detail explaining why I felt like that. So I've got those 4 key ideas, ideas matching with each of those 4 cues there. And then of course I should have a bit of extra time in that 1-minute preparation time to think of some maybe phrases or vocabulary I'm going to use when I'm explaining those ideas. Things that I think could impress the examiner a bit, but also, you know, are natural to use when I'm describing this kind of event. So the first thing, of course, I said whose wedding it was, my sister and my brother-in-law. And really just a nice kind of phrase to describe those two people. Well, they're a lovely couple. Nothing too impressive here, but a nice adjective and noun, a good collocation between those two words, and it describes them well. So a lovely couple. Then I'd move on to the second cue, which of course was when and where it was. And of course I mentioned the place, Belgrade, and a phrase that describes this city quite well is that it is steeped in history. Now this is a nice phrase here that's quite commonly used by native speakers, but less known by people who are learning English as a second language. But to be steeped in history means, well, a place that has a lot of history. That is a very old place, basically. And of course I can go into more detail describing that, but remembering to say that phrase when I am describing the place. Now, the third cue, of course, was what happened at the wedding. And I said, well, you know, there was a ceremony and a party. A word I could use here to describe the party and ceremony is an adjective, and the adjective is lavish. Maybe an adjective that some of you have never seen before, but it does fit the context here, which kind of means a fancy or luxurious event. We could use the word lavish. So a nice adjective that I can make sure I use when I'm describing this wedding. And then finally, we had the final cue, which was about how I felt at the wedding. And I said emotional. And again, we could think about describing that in a bit more detail. And I could use this phrasal verb, teared up, to tear up. And this means, well, it's probably quite obvious what this means because it's connected to the noun tear. But basically, it's when you kind of are almost crying or just about to cry, usually because of, well, something that is emotional and is making you feel kind of maybe extreme happiness or also sadness. But here in my case, it was happiness. But the phrasal verb tear up here is nice kind of idiomatic vocabulary that we can use in this context. It fits really well. So there we go. Those are my ideas and a bit of vocabulary to match with my ideas as well. Hopefully, well, you can go away and have a think about how you would respond to this cue card and practice a bit responding to it, trying to speak for that full 2 minutes and going through those 4 cues step by step, giving as much detail as you can. And in next week's video, I will give my full response for this cue card following these ideas and vocabulary. Now, I hope this has been helpful. If it has, then do remember to click the like button. And if you haven't already, click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any similar videos in the future. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you in the next video.